Usually when we picture a military fortress, we have a very specific architectural image in our heads, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You build the thickest walls facing the enemy.
Yeah, you point your heaviest artillery at the threat vector, you lock the front door because, well, that is the logical entry point for the invader.
Right, it is the absolute bedrock of defensive warfare doctrine. I mean, you're stretching back centuries. You analyze the topography, you anticipate the enemy's path of least resistance, and you harden that specific approach.
Exactly.
Conventional military engineering basically dictates that you do not waste resources defending a wall that the enemy cannot physically reach.
But consider the paradox here. Imagine defending a coastal fortress where your absolute certainty about the enemy's approach becomes your fatal flaw.
It's a terrifying thought.
Right. Imagine being so confident about where the threat is coming from that you literally do not construct defenses facing the opposite direction. Your back door is just an ocean of scorching, waterless sand.
Yeah, because every military academy textbook, every logistical calculation, every topographical survey tells you that crossing that desert with a fighting force is a geographical, biological, and mathematical impossibility.
So you leave it completely unguarded. You orient every single gun, every trench, and every watchtower toward the sea.
You rely entirely on the environment to serve as this impenetrable rear guard. And you sleep soundly believing the desert is a better shield than, any concrete wall.
And that precise assumption is exactly how you lose everything. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are stripping away the mythology and looking strictly through the lens of military history at one of the most audacious, logic-defying operations of the 20th century.
The 1917 capture of Aqaba.
Yes. If you are joining us, probably already know the broad strokes of World War I in the Middle East. You know the names. But today, we are going to really tear down the mechanics of this campaign.
We're bypassing the Hollywood dramatizations to examine the grueling logistics, the clash of military doctrines, and honestly, the sheer human endurance required to weaponize an impassable desert.
Exactly. And our roadmap for this analysis relies on an exhaustive, first-hand battlefield study from Michael Prichter over at battlefieldtravels.com. He mapped the campaign of the Arab Northern Army and T.E. Lawrence.
And this research is incredible because it doesn't just synthesize the old dispatches from Cairo or the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. It cross-references those century-old documents with modern GIS overlays.
Oh, wow. So it's super high-tech.
Very. Topographical mapping, on-the-ground exploration of the inland route from El Wejh to the Red Sea coast. We're looking at the exact distances, the precise locations of the water wells, and the physical realities of the terrain.
All to understand how a highly irregular hybrid force completely dismantled a conventional entrenched garrison. Because we are talking about a flanking maneuver that spanned 1,000 kilometers.
1,000 kilometers. It's staggering.
A march across the Nefud Desert, some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, just to strike a heavily armed fortress from the one direction they were mathematically certain was secure. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We really cannot appreciate the tactical brilliance of the march without first mapping out the macro-level strategic chessboard of the Middle East in early 1917.
Right, because the capture of Aqaba doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is a vital puzzle piece in a much larger, incredibly complex theater of war.
So to frame this properly, we need to understand the Ottoman Empire's footprint in the Hejaz, right?
Yes, the region encompassing modern-day western Saudi Arabia and southern Jordan. By 1916, when the Arab Revolt officially began under Sherif Hussein bin Ali, the Emir of Mecca, the Ottoman control over this massive territory was actually quite brittle.
Brittle how? Like they were stretched too thin.
Exactly. They did not control the vast interior at all. Their power was tethered entirely to the coastal trading ports in the major cities, and those were linked by a very fragile umbilical cord, the Hejaz Railway.
Ah, the railway. So the desert interior basically belonged entirely to the Bedouin tribes, which creates this stark divide in how power was projected.
Very stark.
The Ottomans had the infrastructure, but the Arab forces had total mastery of the negative space between those points of infrastructure.
That is a crucial distinction. And when the Ottoman Empire allied with the Central Powers, the British recognized an opportunity to exploit that brittle control.
Right, because British High Command in Cairo wanted to spark a localized rebellion.
Exactly, to tie down Turkish troops who might otherwise be deployed against British forces in Palestine or, up in Mesopotamia.
So the initial uprisings in 1916 saw Arab forces successfully capture Mecca and a few coastal towns. But then the momentum stalled, right?
Yeah, the Ottomans dug in. They massively reinforced their garrison in Medina, which effectively halted the Arab advance.
Okay, and this brings us to the broader Allied movements. General Sir Edmund Allenby is taking command of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force.
Preparing a massive conventional offensive right into Palestine.
Simultaneously, British and Indian forces are pushing up through Mesopotamia toward Baghdad. So the Hejaz sits squarely between these two colossal fronts. It's this massive, volatile wedge.
And anchored at the very northern tip of that wedge is the port of Aqaba.
Which historically might seem like just a minor coastal town, but in the specific geopolitical geometry of 1917, its value was astronomical.
Oh, for the Ottomans, Aqaba was their absolute last foothold on the Red Sea. Losing it meant losing their final maritime connection in the region.
Completely severing the coastal supply routes.
Exactly. And irrevocably isolating their forces further south in the Hejaz.
Isolating them specifically in Medina. Now, the Ottoman garrison in Medina was enormous. And common military logic, especially the liberation mindset driving Prince Faisal and the Arab leadership, would dictate that Medina is the ultimate prize, right?
It's the holy city. It's the center of gravity for the occupying army. Naturally, you'd think you marshal your forces, you lay siege, and you crush the enemy's stronghold.
But T.E. Lawrence, serving as a British liaison officer, proposes a strategy that completely inverts that logic. He advocates emphatically, we must not take Medina.
Which is just a masterstroke of asymmetrical warfare. Lawrence evaluated the logistical burden of the Medina garrison and realized that tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers sitting static in a desert city were completely neutralized.
They posed zero offensive threat to Allenby's forces in Palestine.
Right. And if the Arab army were to actually achieve a conventional victory and force Medina to surrender, the Allies would suddenly inherit thousands of prisoners of war.
Yeah, it becomes a liability transfer. You take their troops, but you also take on the caloric responsibility of feeding them, guarding them, housing them in prison camps in Egypt.
You are essentially paying the maintenance costs for your enemy's army.
That's a great way to put it. Lawrence's calculation was ruthless but brilliant. Leave the garrison intact, but cut them off from everything except the Hejaz Railway.
Exactly. By doing so, he transformed the Medina garrison from a military asset into a massive strategic parasite, draining the Ottoman war machine.
So the Turks were forced to dedicate immense resources, rolling stock, and thousands of additional troops just to guard the 1,300 kilometers of vulnerable railway track.
Yes, winding through hostile desert to feed an army that wasn't actually fighting anyone.
It is the architectural equivalent of a black hole. Medina just sat there, exerting this massive gravitational pull on Ottoman resources, sucking in trains, ammunition, and manpower that the Turkish high command desperately needed on the Russian or Palestinian fronts.
It's a flawless execution of the army in being doctrine. You don't engage the enemy's main force. You simply remain an ambient lethal threat that forces them into a state of perpetual exhausting defense.
This reminds me of the difference between playing Western chess and the game of Go.
Oh, how so?
Well, in chess, you march straight for the king, right? That's the objective, capture Medina. But in Go, it's not about capturing the king right away. It's about controlling the empty space around the pieces until the enemy literally suffocates.
That is a perfect analogy. The army in being concept usually refers to a weaker naval fleet, avoiding a decisive battle to keep the enemy's larger fleet tied down guarding shipping lanes. But Lawrence adapted it for desert warfare.
He weaponized the Ottoman Empire's own scale and logistical requirements against them. But wouldn't Prince Faisal and the Arab leaders naturally want to liberate their major cities first? I mean, how hard is it to convince an army not to attack the enemy's biggest base?
It is an incredibly difficult proposition. It goes against every martial instinct. Lawrence had to cultivate immense personal capital with Faisal to convince him that victory wasn't defined by storming the gates of Medina, but by starving it.
He had to sell a strategy of strategic patience and relentless attrition.
Yes. The Arab forces would focus entirely on sabotage, dynamiting trains, destroying water towers, and melting back into the desert before the Ottomans could mount a punitive response.
But a guerrilla force dedicated entirely to railway sabotage still needs a logistical anchor, right? They need a secure base to receive gold, weapons, and food from the British.
Exactly. And supplying the Arab Northern Army over land from the Sinai was a logistical nightmare. But if they capture Aqaba, the equation changes overnight.
The Royal Navy can simply sail up the Gulf of Aqaba and offload supplies directly onto the docks,
creating a fortified right flank for Allenby's impending push into Palestine. Aqaba was the linchpin.
So capturing it wouldn't just solve the Allied logistical bottleneck. It would fundamentally legitimize the Arab Revolt.
You would elevate them from a localized nuisance, a band of railway raiders, into a recognized, effective military entity capable of taking and holding vital strategic infrastructure.
The objective is clear, but achieving it required a force capable of bypassing the Ottoman defenses by traversing the Nefud Desert. And this wasn't a job for a standard British infantry division.
No, not at all.
We really need to dissect the actual anatomy of the armies involved here because this campaign represents a violent collision of two completely incompatible military doctrines. Let's break down the composition of the Arab army that Lawrence and Prince Faisal assembled.
The Arab force that ultimately marched on Aqaba was a highly specialized, hybrid organization. By the time they reached their target, the ranks had swelled to roughly 1,200 to 1,800 men.
That's quite a size for a desert crossing.
It is, and it was divided into two distinct components that operated in tandem. The core discipline was provided by the Hashemite regulars, commanded by Sherif Nasir ibn Ali.
Now, these regulars were fundamentally different from the tribal fighters.
They're very different. Many of them were former Ottoman conscripts of Arab descent who had either been captured by the British or had voluntarily defected.
So they understood conventional military structure, they wore uniforms, they were trained in standard infantry tactics, and they were familiar with the Mauser rifles used by the Ottomans.
Right. Numbering around 300 to 400 men, they provided the operational skeleton for the army. They understood how to hold a line, how to manage volley fire, and crucially, they had the disciplined resilience required to maintain cohesion during a grueling, multi-week desert deployment.
But a skeleton needs muscle, and in this environment, that muscle had to be incredibly fast and completely adapted to the terrain. That brings us to the irregulars.
Yes, the tribal fighters, primarily drawn from the Howeitat and Bani Atiyah tribes, were the operational muscle. This contingent fluctuated between 700 and 1,200 men, and they were commanded in the field by Auda Tayi,
Auda is just a legendary figure.
a chieftain who commanded absolute loyalty and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the deep desert. His men did not fight in ranks. They were highly mobile, light cavalry, operating primarily on camelback.
And they carried almost no logistical tail. They didn't have supply wagons dragging behind them. They didn't have field kitchens.
No, they survived on minimal rations, primarily unleavened bread and whatever water they could carry or find. Their combat doctrine was rooted in the Bedouin raiding tradition. Strike with overwhelming speed, utilize the terrain for concealment, and disengage before the enemy can bring heavier weapons to bear.
And operating alongside these fighters was an essential support column of camel drivers, scouts, and water navigators.
Oh, the water navigators are the unsung technicians of this entire operation.
Without their ability to read the subtle changes in the sand or the sparse vegetation to locate ancient buried cisterns, that army dies of dehydration in 3 days.
Without a doubt.
But let's look at the gaping holes in their arsenal. They had no heavy artillery, they had no entrenched supply lines, they were essentially a swarm force.
A swarm force entirely reliant on velocity and surprise. Now contrast that with the Ottoman defensive posture at Aqaba. The Ottomans were operating on standard European-influenced military doctrine.
Right. They established the regional headquarters inland at Mahan, garrisoning roughly 800 troops with mountain artillery.
And from Mahan, they pushed a forward operating base out to the Wadi Aba el Lissan, stationing about 400 men there as an early warning tripwire.
A tripwire designed to absorb initial contact from an attacking force, force them to deploy, and buy time for the main body at Mahan to mobilize and reinforce.
Exactly the textbook application of defense in depth. Finally, the Aqaba fortress itself, situated right on the coast, was garrisoned by approximately 300 men, comprising 2 infantry companies and a local militia detachment.
But the architecture of their defense reveals the fatal cognitive bias of their high command. They built their trenches, their redoubts, and their heavy artillery emplacements facing the Red Sea.
They were preparing for an amphibious assault by the Royal Navy. They were looking at the massive 15-inch guns of British dreadnoughts and assuming that was the only logical threat to a coastal port.
Because the military education of the Ottoman officer class in 1917, which was heavily influenced by their German advisors, was rigidly mathematical.
What's fascinating here is how inflexible that math was. An army of sufficient size to threaten a fortress required X amount of food per day, which necessitated Y number of supply wagons, which required Z miles of paved roads or rail lines.
Right, so when the Ottoman commanders looked eastward at the Nefud Desert, just this chaotic expanse of shifting dunes, basalt plains, and zero infrastructure, Their logistical algorithms outputted a zero probability of attack.
It's an algorithmic failure.
Yeah.
They aren't stupid. They're just strictly applying a mechanical formula to a biological problem.
It sounds like a heavyweight boxer preparing for a title fight, and a swarm of bees shows up instead. Can't punch a swarm.
That's brilliant. Yeah, they calculated that a conventional army couldn't cross the Nefud, which was entirely correct. Their failure was in lacking the imagination to conceive of an unconventional army that didn't require wagons or roads.
They were playing chess, anticipating rooks and knights, and Lawrence brought a swarm of locusts to the board.
The psychological comfort of that algorithm is what Lawrence exploited. He knew the Ottomans would never post substantial lookouts facing the inland desert because their manuals explicitly stated the desert was impassable.
Lawrence just weaponized their own military curriculum against them. But to capitalize on that algorithmic blind spot, the Arab force actually had to survive the environment the Ottomans deemed impassable.
Right. The theoretical brilliance of bypassing Medina means absolutely nothing if the desert kills your army before you fire a single shot.
The logistics of the inland march are just staggering.
The operation commenced on May 19, 1917. They departed from the Red Sea port of Al-Wajh, and the sheer audacity of the deception is evident in their route right from the start.
Because the most direct path to Aqaba would have been to march straight north up the coastline, right?
Exactly. But doing so would have immediately alerted the Ottoman coastal garrisons and drawn a conventional defensive response.
So instead, Lawrence and a vanguard of just 45 men embark on a massive, sweeping inland arc. They drive deep northeast into the interior, intentionally plunging into the brutal environment of the Nefud.
Pushing north toward the Wadi Sirhan before eventually pivoting back southwest toward their target. It was a circuitous journey exceeding 1,000 kilometers, executed during May and June.
We are talking about navigating an environment where ambient temperatures routinely hit 45 degrees Celsius. That is 113 degrees Fahrenheit.
The physical toll on the human body at that temperature, combined with the exertion of riding and managing livestock in deep sand, is catastrophic.
Yeah, the dehydration isn't just a thirst issue. It's a critical physiological breakdown. Blood thickens, cognitive function plummets, and heat stroke becomes an immediate lethal threat.
Lawrence's own writings capture the psychological weight of the environment perfectly. He described the Nefud as a place where the heat of the day made the red sand dunes flicker and the horizon melt. He explicitly noted it was not a country for mistakes.
A mistake in European trench warfare meant you might get outflanked. A navigational mistake in the Nefud meant the entire column perished.
In conventional warfare, terrain is an obstacle you conquer. You take the high ground, you bridge the river. In deep desert warfare, the terrain is an apex predator you merely survive.
And the entire operational tempo was dictated by the mathematics of water control. Let's delve into that math for a second. You have over 1,000 men and even more camels.
And a camel is a biological marvel. It can march for days without drinking by utilizing complex physiological adaptations to retain moisture.
But when a dehydrated camel finally reaches a water source, it needs to consume 20 to 30 gallons of water rapidly to recover. Multiply that by 1,000 animals.
You aren't just looking for a puddle. You need a massive, sustainable aquifer.
This is why the precise location of ancient wells dictated the route. The historical record highlights two critical geographical anchor points: the wells at Beir and Jeffur.
The survival of the Arab Northern Army hinged entirely on reaching these specific coordinates before their carrying capacity ran out. But the Ottomans, despite their overarching strategic blindness, were not entirely ignorant of the desert's microgeography.
Right, they knew these wells existed.
Yes. And they engaged in a localized scorched earth tactic. When the Arab vanguard reached the wells at Beir, they discovered the Ottoman patrols had deliberately fouled them.
Well, fouling is just a brutal ancient tactic. It involves collapsing the stone casings of the shaft, dumping animal carcasses into the water to breed disease, or filling the entire bore with tons of surrounding sand.
It is designed to deny the resource without having to station troops to guard it. And when they pushed forward to the next critical water source at Jeffur, they found that well had also been systematically destroyed by the Turks.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This presents a fascinating tactical paradox. If the Ottoman commanders took the time and manpower to send patrols out into the desert specifically to destroy the wells at Beir and Jeffur, they clearly acknowledged that someone could use them, right? They knew the desert wasn't completely empty, so why rely on simply collapsing a well? Why not just station a reinforced platoon with heavy machine guns at the water source to slaughter anyone who approaches?
It comes down to the economy of force and the tyranny of distance. The Ottoman military was already stretched to its absolute breaking point, garrisoning the Hejaz Railway and the coastal ports. Beir and Jaffa are incredibly isolated.
Right.
To station a permanent garrison of 100 men at a remote well means you have to establish a continuous, secure supply line to feed those men, rotate them out, and provide them with ammunition.
You'd be creating a micro-Medina, a tiny, isolated garrison that eats up more logistical resources than it provides in tactical value.
Exactly. The Ottomans performed a cost-benefit analysis. They assumed any force navigating the deep desert would be a small, lightly armed Bedouin raiding party. Collapsing a well is a cheap, temporary denial tactic that easily thwarts a small raid.
They never conceived that a highly organized army of over 1,000 men was bearing down on that water source.
But the Arab army was there, and they were dying of thirst. The destruction of the Jaffa well forced the entire column to halt.
They had to dismount and engage in hours of backbreaking manual labor in 110-degree heat, digging out the silted, collapsed shafts by hand just to reach the muddy water table below to save the animals and themselves.
It's a moment of immense vulnerability. If an Ottoman patrol spots them while they are trapped digging out that well, the campaign ends right there in the sand.
But the Ottomans didn't spot them, largely due to a brilliantly executed deception operation.
Yes. Lawrence understood that moving 1,000 men across the desert generates rumors. The Bedouin network communicates. To mask their true vector, Lawrence orchestrated a diversionary strike against a small Ottoman outpost on the Hejaz Railway before the main column pivoted south toward Aqaba.
It is the tactical equivalent of sleight of hand. You make a loud noise with your left hand so the enemy doesn't see your right hand holding the dagger. The Ottomans receive panic telegraphs that the Arabs are attacking the railway again.
It perfectly confirmed the existing bias of the Ottoman High Command. They processed the intelligence and concluded it was just another standard nuisance raid on the tracks.
So they mobilized their quick reaction forces along the rail line, entirely missing the fact that the massive consolidated Arab army had already turned their backs on the railway and were marching deep behind enemy lines directly toward the coast.
The deception holds. They survive the thermal nightmare of the Nefud. They manually excavate the destroyed wells. They successfully rendezvous with Auda Abu Tayi's forces at Al-Qurat, swelling their ranks.
And they navigate 1,000 kilometers of hostile geography to arrive perfectly positioned in the Ottoman rear. But the geography naturally funnels them into a choke point. They cannot bypass the inland approaches to the coast.
And this brings us to the critical violent convergence of the campaign. The history books often romanticize the surrender of the Aqaba seaport, but the actual military turning point, the crucible where the campaign was won or lost, occurred roughly 80 kilometers northeast of the coast at the Battle of Aba el Lissan.
Aba el Lissan is that tripwire outpost we analyzed earlier, right?
Yes. It sits in a valley that controls one of the final viable water sources before the descent to the coast. It is a natural topographical bottleneck.
And the Ottomans recognized its defensive value. Anticipating some localized tribal movement, they had reinforced the position.
On July 1st, 1917, the Ottomans deployed a substantial blocking force from Mahan down to Aba el Lissan. We are looking at roughly 400 regular troops drawn from the 161st and 130th Infantry Regiments, supported by mountain artillery batteries.
These were entrenched, disciplined soldiers holding the high ground around a vital water source.
And the Arab force, exhausted from weeks of marching, emerges from the desert and collides with a fully prepared, conventional infantry battalion blocking their only path forward.
A direct frontal assault by irregular camel cavalry against entrenched mountain guns is suicide.
Lawrence and Sherif Nasir understood the tactical disparity. When they arrived on July 2nd, they did not order an immediate charge. Instead, they utilized the rugged, broken terrain surrounding the valley.
They dismounted their fighters and initiated a sweeping envelopment, positioning their men along the ridges looking down into the Ottoman positions.
The Ottomans might hold the valley floor and the water, but the Arabs secure the elevated rim. And then begins a grueling application of psychological and attritional warfare.
For an entire day under the punishing July sun, the Arab forces poured continuous, plunging rifle fire down into the Ottoman trenches.
They employed skilled sharpshooters to specifically target Turkish officers, artillery crews, and anyone attempting to move supplies or access the water.
Consider the psychological degradation of the Ottoman infantry in that valley. They are trained for conventional line battles. Now they are pinned down in a rocky basin, baking in the heat, taking accurate sniper fire from unseen enemies hidden in the crags above.
They cannot maneuver, Their artillery cannot elevate effectively to hit the dispersed targets on the ridges, and their casualty rate is slowly ticking upward.
The ambient terror of that situation erodes unit cohesion rapidly. However, a standoff inherently favors the entrenched defender, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Arab corps did not possess the logistical depth to maintain a protracted siege. They had no supply lines bringing up food or ammunition.
They had to force a decisive break in the Ottoman lines before their own fragile coalition fractured from exhaustion.
The pressure cooker reaches its boiling point on July 3rd. The sharpshooting has degraded the Turkish morale, but the trenches are still manned. The Arab ammunition is dwindling. The heat is unbearable.
And this is when Auda Abu Tayi fundamentally breaks the rules of modern warfare. He recognizes that the Ottoman psychology is brittle, and he applies maximum localized shock.
Auda gathers a highly specialized vanguard of about 50 horsemen. This is a crucial logistical detail. While the vast majority of the Arab force utilized camels for strategic mobility, because camels can survive the deep desert elite, Bedouin leaders like Auda often brought prized Arabian horses with them.
Leading them alongside the camels.
Exactly, specifically reserving them for short, explosive tactical engagements. A horse cannot march 1,000 kilometers across the Nefud, but in a localized high-speed charge, it offers unparalleled maneuverability and acceleration.
Armed primarily with swords and rifles, Auda leads these 50 horsemen in a wild, screaming, instinctual frontal charge down the ridge, plunging directly into the heart of the entrenched Ottoman infantry.
It is an act of sheer tactical audacity. In the context of 1917, the era of the Somme, of synchronized machine gun crossfire, of industrialized slaughter, a sword-wielding cavalry charge against entrenched infantry should have been annihilated in seconds.
But the sheer anachronistic shock of it triggers a cognitive paralysis in the defenders. It's like someone bringing a sword to a gunfight and actually winning because the guy with the gun is too shocked to pull the trigger.
That's exactly what happened. The Ottoman soldiers are exhausted, terrified, and conceptually unprepared for a medieval cavalry charge materializing out of the heat haze. They simply break. The officers lose control, the discipline evaporates, and the soldiers abandon their firing positions.
Auda's charge acts as a localized tactical wedge that shatters the entire Ottoman defensive algorithm. The moment the line fractures and the troops panic, Sherif Nasir and Lawrence exploit the collapse.
They signal the main body of the Arab force to surge down from the surrounding ridges, flooding the valley from multiple vectors.
It transitions instantly from a standoff into a rout. The Ottoman battalion is utterly dismantled. The historical casualty figures are staggering for an engagement of this scale.
Over 300 Ottoman regular soldiers are killed in the valley, and at least 160 are taken prisoner. A 400-man reinforced garrison is effectively erased from the order of battle.
The Battle of Aba el Lissan is the true strategic fulcrum of the campaign. Prior to July 3rd, the Arab Northern Army was perceived by the British and the Ottomans alike as a capable nuisance.
Proficient at asymmetrical sabotage, sure, but incapable of holding ground. Aba el Lissan proved that this hybrid force could maneuver, envelop, and utterly destroy a regular, entrenched Ottoman infantry regiment in a pitched battle.
It shattered the aura of Ottoman invincibility in the region. With the tripwire destroyed and the main garrison reeling from the catastrophic loss of their forward battalion, the geographical bottleneck is shattered.
The road descending to the coast is wide open. The climax of this impossible march through the Nefud delivers us to what is, in military terms, an almost surreal anticlimax.
The actual capitulation of the Aqaba fortress.
Exactly. The Arab column pushes relentlessly south, sweeping aside minor security checkpoints and absorbing local tribal fighters eager to join the victorious momentum. By July 5th, the vanguard reaches the outskirts of Aqaba.
And what awaits them is a garrison of 300 Ottoman troops trapped in an architectural failure of their own design. As Lawrence famously noted, the Turks had built their wall facing the wrong enemy.
The fatal flaw of the Ottoman coastal defense strategy is fully exposed. The intricate trench networks, the concrete redoubts, and the heavy coastal artillery are entirely oriented toward the Gulf of Aqaba.
Naval artillery is designed to engage massive, slow-moving dreadnoughts miles out to sea. The guns are bolted into fixed emplacements with severely limited traverse capabilities.
You cannot simply unbolt a massive naval gun, pivot at 180 degrees, and depress the barrel to fire at infantry creeping down the wadis behind the town.
Right. The Ottoman heavy weapons are effectively rendered inert by the Arab army's geometry of approach.
The garrison commander is confronted with an unsolvable tactical problem. He is staring at an overwhelming, highly mobile enemy force occupying the high ground behind his fortress. His primary weapons are useless.
He has undoubtedly received fragmentary, terrifying reports of the slaughter at Aba el Lissan.
Right. And his communication lines to the regional headquarters at Marian have been severed, meaning no reinforcements are coming.
So Lawrence doesn't even have to order an assault? He understands the psychological leverage he holds. On the evening of July 5th, he delivers a stark ultimatum to the Ottoman commander. Surrender the garrison peacefully by morning, or face a full-scale assault.
The Ottoman commander calculates the odds, recognizes his position is completely untenable, and capitulates. On July 6, 1917, the final Ottoman stronghold on the Red Sea surrenders without a single shot being fired in the streets of Aqaba.
It is a breathtaking strategic victory. Across the entirety of the march and the battle, the Arab forces capture over 700 Ottoman prisoners. The Hashemite flag is raised over the port. They have achieved the impossible.
They crossed the uncrossable desert, annihilated a blocking force, and captured a vital strategic node.
And the moment the adrenaline fades, they slam into a brutal, terrifying logistical reality.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the eternal, unforgiving truth of military operations. Securing the objective often creates an immediate, cascading logistical disaster. On July 7th, the victorious Arab army finds itself in possession of a vital deep-water port, but they are entirely cut off from the world.
They have 700 prisoners of war sitting on the beach. They have hundreds of exhausted fighters and starving camels. They've expended nearly all their ammunition.
They have almost no medical supplies to treat the wounded from Aba el Lissan, and crucially, they have no food.
The Ottoman garrison had minimal stores, certainly not enough to feed 1,000 extra men and 700 prisoners.
If the Arab force remains in Aqaba without resupply, they will starve within days, or the prisoners will riot, or the Ottomans in Man will reorganize and launch a counterattack against a completely depleted force.
And the most agonizing detail is that the British High Command in Cairo has absolutely no idea that Lawrence and Faisal actually succeeded.
There is no telegraph station in Aqaba capable of reaching Egypt. The Royal Navy isn't idling offshore waiting for a flare.
The victory is completely meaningless and potentially fatal unless they can establish immediate contact with the British logistical network.
Lawrence recognizes the existential threat. He cannot afford to wait. He takes immediate extreme action. Accompanied by a single local guide, he mounts a camel and embarks on a desperate ride across the Sinai Peninsula toward the British General Headquarters at Ismailia, near Cairo.
So what does this all mean for Lawrence personally? I mean, stop and process the physical toll of that decision. He has just spent 2 months orchestrating a 1,000-kilometer march through the Nefud.
Yeah, he has survived dehydration, fought a pitched battle at Aba el Lissan, negotiated a surrender.
And his immediate reward is to launch himself into another 250-kilometer ride across the Sinai Desert in the middle of July. He goes from being a liaison officer playing in the sand to showing up in Cairo basically saying, "Hey, I just conquered a city. Send groceries."
The historical accounts detail the sheer physical breakdown he endured. Riding for 49 hours out of a 72-hour period, pushing the camels to the absolute brink of collapse, navigating entirely by the stars and raw instinct.
It was an act of supreme physical endurance fueled entirely by the desperation of knowing his army would die if he failed.
He finally reaches the Suez Canal, crosses it, and effectively bursts into the British headquarters. He secures an audience with General Sir Archibald Murray and General Edmund Allenby, who had just arrived to take command.
Imagine the scene. Lawrence, emaciated, covered in desert sand, wearing Bedouin robes, standing before the meticulously uniformed British High Command, casually announcing that he and a tribal army have just conquered the last Ottoman port on the Red Sea, and he urgently needs them to dispatch supply ships to feed his prisoners. How did the British brass react to this irregular warfare actually working?
The reaction at General Headquarters was a mixture of profound shock and immediate mobilization. Up until that precise moment, conventional British generals largely viewed the Arab Revolt as a strategic sideshow.
A useful distraction, but not a primary theater of decisive action.
Lawrence's presentation of Aqaba on a silver platter fundamentally shattered that prejudice. He proved conclusively that deep local intelligence, unparalleled mobility, and the audacious exploitation of terrain could achieve strategic objectives that massive artillery barrages and trench offensives could not.
The British military apparatus immediately pivoted. The Royal Navy dispatched ships loaded with food, weapons, and medical supplies to Aqaba.
British engineers were sent to stabilize the port infrastructure and install wireless communication arrays. Aqaba was rapidly transformed from an isolated Ottoman outpost into a massive, fortified forward operating base for the Arab Northern Army.
And the strategic ripple effects of this transformation fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war in the Middle East. Let's look at the legacy of the campaign. The capture of Aqaba wasn't just a localized victory, it was the geopolitical lever that moved the entire region.
Exactly. General Allenby was preparing to launch his massive offensive against the Ottoman lines at Gaza and Beersheba. With Aqaba secured, Allenby's right flank was entirely protected from Ottoman flanking maneuvers.
Furthermore, from the newly established base at Aqaba, the Arab Northern Army could project power deep into modern-day Jordan and Syria.
They systematically dismantled the Hejaz Railway, permanently severing the Ottoman forces in Medina from the rest of the war. They became the anvil against which Allenby's hammer struck, eventually leading to the capture of Jerusalem and ultimately the fall of Damascus.
It also cemented the political legitimacy of Prince Faisal and the Hashemite forces. They were no longer just insurgents. They were recognized, victorious allies of the British Empire, which granted them immense political leverage in the post-war negotiations that ultimately drew the borders of the modern Middle East.
The political DNA of nations like Jordan and Iraq is directly linked to the success of that impossible march. Yet, despite the immense historical and political weight of the actual events, public consciousness of this campaign is almost entirely dictated by its cinematic portrayal.
When most people envision the capture of Aqaba, they see the sweeping 70mm cinematography of David Lean's 1962 masterpiece, Lawrence of Arabia.
It is a monumental piece of filmmaking, but as Prichter's battlefield topography studies point out, it takes massive liberties with the tactical reality for the sake of visual storytelling.
The film essentially compresses the timeline and geography, merging the grueling infantry battle at Aba el Lissan directly into the capture of Aqaba.
It depicts Peter O'Toole and Omar Sharif leading a massive, chaotic camel charge directly through the coastal town, overrunning the coastal artillery in a dramatic melee.
From a historical standpoint, that cinematic charge never happened. As we established, the actual surrender of the town was a bloodless negotiation following the destruction of the blocking force 80 kilometers inland.
However, while the film sacrifices tactical accuracy, it brilliantly captures the psychological truth of the campaign. The environment is the true antagonist of the story.
There is a profound moment in the film where Sherif Nasir gazes out over the shimmering heat of the desert and states, "The Nefud is the worst place God created."
That single line of dialogue perfectly encapsulates the psychological barrier that the Ottoman High Command could not overcome. They looked at that same desert and believed it was a divine shield.
And that geographical anchor remains visible today. If you look at the modern topographical surveys and travel reports from researchers mapping the route, the contrast is striking. Modern Aqaba is a sprawling, bustling Jordanian port city, heavily industrialized and vital to global shipping.
Yet the physical anchors of 1917 are still embedded in the urban landscape. The 16th century Mamluk castle, which served as the Ottoman headquarters, still stands.
It is preserved right next to the Great Arab Revolt Plaza, featuring a towering flagpole that visually dominates the coastline, serving as a permanent monument to the campaign. But what I find truly fascinating is what happens when you leave the city and trace the route backward into the interior.
As you move inland through the Wadi Rum, a landscape of sheer granite cliffs and red sand that has served as an alien backdrop for films like The Martian and Star Wars, the topography remains completely unchanged from when Lawrence and Auda Abu Tai rode through it.
The ancient wells, including the specific spring known as Lawrence's Well, still exist precisely where the historical cartography placed them. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but Lawrence's Well is still there, still dispensing water, just like it did in 1917.
The juxtaposition is incredibly powerful. The British Empire has contracted. The geopolitical map has been redrawn countless times, but the deep desert remains indifferent to human ambition.
The granite ridges of Aba el Lissan and the ancient aquifers hidden beneath the sand are exactly as they were in 1917, silent witnesses to one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers in military history.
This raises an important question. Knowledge is only valuable when applied. The geography is eternal. Only our human understanding of how to traverse it and exploit it evolves. The Ottoman failure at Aqaba was not a failure of courage or firepower. It was an intellectual failure.
They allowed conventional doctrine to blind them to unconventional possibilities. They assumed that because a task was impossible for them, it was universally impossible.
Critical thinking and challenging assumptions is vital in any era. Lawrence didn't defeat the Ottomans with superior firepower. He defeated them with superior imagination. He understood that the only thing more dangerous than a heavily defended wall is an unguarded desert that your enemy believes is uncrossable.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we've seen how audacity and deep local knowledge can completely unravel conventional logic. From the strategic patience of ignoring Medina to the grueling Nefud crossing, the shock at Aba el Lissan, and the bloodless fall of coastal guns pointing the wrong way. But I want to leave you with a brand new concept to ponder. Based on Lawrence's success in exploiting an impassable environment, look at our world today. How much of modern global border security, from the Himalayas to the Darien Gap, still relies on the flawed, century-old assumption that extreme geography is a natural wall that doesn't need to be defended? As climate change alters landscapes and new technology like drones make terrain irrelevant, are modern nations making the exact same mistake the Ottomans made at Aqaba? The sands of Aqaba remind us that the moment you declare a vulnerability impossible to exploit, you have already lost the initiative. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the logistics, the psychology, and the brutal reality of the 1917 campaign. Keep questioning the consensus, check your blind spots, and we will see you next time.